All right. Well, thanks everyone for joining. So we'll have, I'll run through introductions and our thesis here, but just by way of logistics, we'll have 40 minutes for this session. I have allocated about 10 minutes at the end for Q&A, so we've got a mic set up here. So we'll walk through some discussion and then feel free to ask questions at the end. Maybe a good place to start is introducing kind of why we're all here today. So bridging the gap between early innovation and achieving commercial success is amongst the hardest challenges that startups face in the medtech industry. We're endearingly calling this panel the Valley of Death, which, or maybe not endearingly, dangerously, but once startups achieve funding, they have to navigate ever-changing regulatory environments, and fundraising, achieving reimbursement, generating clinical evidence that needs to satisfy multiple stakeholders. So payers, CMS, regulatory bodies, investors. What we're going to focus here on is tips and tricks as well as strategies that people from all different perspectives in the industry you'll hear in their introductions to help startups as they're navigating and really commercializing the device. So with that being said, Adam, if you want to introduce kind of your background of expertise, and we'll come down the line, and then I'll start with some Q&A.
Sure. Thanks, Ivanny. And I was hoping that a title like The Valley of Death would get a few more people here. It's an intriguing title, I think. My background, well, let's see. My parents said I had to be a doctor, so I went and became a cardiac surgeon, which I did for about 25 years. Along the way, I got very interested in medical devices, not just as a user, but as someone who also was helping small companies, large companies, et cetera, do things like benchtop work, preclinical investigations, clinical studies, and so forth. And so when I saw that FDA had a fellowship in regulatory science, I decided I didn't have enough school. So I went and I took that fellowship, and I ended up actually working part-time for FDA, like nights and weekends, while I was still in clinical practice. And I did that for a while. Ended up leaving clinical practice in about 2017 or so, went full-time FDA, got involved in all kinds of pre-market, post-market activities, the digital health center of excellence, and so forth. Left FDA in about 2020 and went into industry, became chief medical officer for some startup companies, small companies building AI products to identify cardiac disease and other like in vitro diagnostic type tests and so forth. I joined NAMSA and Ivanny about 2 years ago, originally as a principal strategy consultant, trying to help companies get through this valley of death type situation, putting things together for them as much as we could, telescoping things as much as we could. And well, I guess today is my 2-month anniversary as their chief medical officer. So I guess they like what I'm doing and gave me more work to do. So there. So anyway, that's me, and thank you for staying awake during that.
Omar.
Well, that's me next. Hi, everybody. My name is Omar Khatib. I'm the founder of Khatib & Co. We're a growth and marketing agency, so we work with medtech startups on raising awareness to investors and commercializing products. I'm also the host of the State of Medtech. I'm sure I popped up on your feed at least a few times today. It's a great podcast. You should check it out. We're very proud to be now partnered with LSI, so a lot of the episodes we're going to be having are going to be powered through a lot of the great market intel that LSI has. In a previous life, similar to Adam, actually, I was in medical school down in Texas. Unlike Adam, I actually saw from Forest Beyond the Trees, and I said, I don't think this is for me, so I should try something a little bit different. So I actually left about halfway through, so I only ended up with an M, and joined it. I'm glad you guys got that one. That joke never lands sometimes. And I joined the industry. I started off in sales, carrying the bag at Lazzaro Robotics, and then went to marketing. As I say, the rest is history. I worked at a lot of emerging medtech startups in robotics, AI, and beyond. And I think probably a hallmark of my career is that I've been a very, very early voice and advocate about using social media to drive product adoption, and more importantly nowadays, the use of dynamic media like content and other things.
All right, so I'm Dawn Bitz. I've been in the medical device industry for the better part of the last, 29 years. Don't almost want to admit that because I'm only 29. today. No, so my career, I've really been honored to have a career in the medical device industry. It's really spanned from very large organizations, having opportunities to have leadership roles in businesses that were worth anything from $250 million to $500 million businesses, and really the whole kind of gamut, 510K all the way through to PMA, bringing products to market, and really being able to have kind of the entire vantage point. But about 9 years ago, I decided to leap to the right side. So that's a slight dig to all of my friends who are still in the big company side. But being able to be an entrepreneur and having a footprint either in operationally helping companies grow and kind of navigate this ideation all the way through to commercialization, or being able to be on the board and doing advisory roles.
Great. Hey, everyone. Sean Cheng, Managing Director at Ascension Ventures, and I lead the MedTech and Life Sciences practice. We are a strategic fund that focuses on anything that really touches hospitals. Our limited partners are the 13 largest health systems in the U.S., including Ascension, which is the largest, covering 150 hospitals, and 12 others that are really nonprofit IDNs that focus on care delivery. And so innovation is something that's desired, but certainly not a focus for a lot of these systems. And the venture fund that we run is, filling that purpose as well as providing the financial returns. We're investing out our Fund 5, which is $285 million, and write checks between 5 and 15. So slightly later stage, but we really play at all stages. Prior to this, my background is I came from corporate venturing, leading investments at Philips Ventures as a partner, looking at both digital health as well as devices. And prior to that, I had a couple of stints in strategy consulting, US FDA as well, and I did a PhD focused on the design of medical devices. So before that, Value of Death, helped launch a couple of companies, and eventually end up where I am. So based out of Boston, and very happy to look forward to this conversation.
Great, thanks everyone. And I'm Ivanny Franklin. I'm the Global Commercial Director at NAMSA. Maybe let's start. This question is probably geared most towards Adam, but can you speak a little bit to some of the pitfalls and associated timelines with achieving reimbursement in general? I love statistics too, if you want to throw in some of the stats from kind of a payer perspective, FDA perspective as well, and how that overlays maybe with product development and reg approval as well.
Okay, so we only have 32 minutes left, but I'll try to make it quick. Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting finding that, especially now that things are changing in the sense that a lot of startup companies are being founded by 3 smart kids in a garage, right? And they don't know what to do with their product, and they don't know what potential it has. They're not business people. And so, there are statistics that have been run on companies like that say that 90% of those companies fail. They never actually make it. And so the question is why? Why are they failing? And you're all familiar with, for example, the NSF and the NIH, and they have a program called SBIR, right? You're all familiar with that. So about 10 years ago, they took a look at why 90% of their fundees were failing and all this money was essentially going into nothing. And what they found out was that the number one cause, which struck me as amazing, is that there's not a product market match. There's not a product fit match. And so you see, and we see a lot of these people in NAMSA as well. They come to us and they're asking for help, for guidance, and we look at it and say, that's an amazing technology. That's fantastic, but I'm not sure anyone's going to buy it or pay for it. And so the companies are laser focused on getting through regulatory, and that's great. They have to be, but FDA doesn't care if you sell a single product. That's not their job, right? So you get through it. And the first company I worked for when I left FDA was in that situation. They had a product, it was on the market, 510K cleared, et cetera, and nobody was buying it, because they hadn't really gotten reimbursement, so nobody was paying for it. They hadn't gotten clinical adoption, so no physicians were interested in it. So what the NIH did was they set up this I-Core program, which is kind of like an MBA in 7 weeks. But the point is, you have to consider all those things and then go out there and figure out, am I on the right track for all these things? And that's really what's not being done. And so when you look at the last statistic I'll give you before I shut up is that the average company spends 5.7 years, almost 6 years, between getting FDA marketing authorization and a coverage determination. Now, how many startups do you know can live 6 years with no revenue? So that's why they're falling into this valley of death, at least most of them. So I'll stop there, and those are the challenges that we see. So
on that note, let's maybe talk about timelines too, because we all recognize startups have to juggle, wear so many hats and juggle so many things, especially in the early stages. So, what advice, or maybe this is a good question for Dawn, what advice would you give for startup companies on when, and I don't want you to say yesterday, but when is too soon, or when is too late for startup companies to start the reimbursement strategy piece if they're also juggling, product development, managing burn rates, all of that, reg strategy too. So how, what's the suggestion or?
Yeah, so the right answer is like 2 weeks ago, 5 nights ago, 6 years ago, right? Just because, really what Adam just said about how long that it takes. But again, we don't always have that time. However, if you think about, and again, we have multiple different hats that we're having to wear. You're having to think about product development. You're having to think about just getting your data and your QMS systems up and running and working through the regulatory hurdles and clinical hurdles, right? But the earlier you can start to think about the economic story, right? And how do you develop that economic story? Well, there's a lot of different areas, right? You can do your literature analysis, and you can look at the current data that's in the current, peer-reviewed publications and start to build what that economic story looks like. That oftentimes will help inform what you do with your clinical strategies, right? And as you are thinking about your endpoints, your primary, secondary endpoints, your efficacy, your safety, and everything that you're navigating to get your data built to be able to not only take it to the FDA, but also to get it on podium in the publications and for commercialization, think about how you can feather in the economic data points that you can start to generate. Then you take on and you look at, data sets that are existing and out there. So who's used MedPAR? Who knows what MedPAR is? Okay, MedPAR is the Medicare data set, right? And it's available, it's publicly available. It actually is based off of DRG codes, but it gives you regionalized data. You look at the reimbursements it can set up. That data set can be very, very important for you to take a look at prevalence of your disease state, or where your hospitals are how much they're getting reimbursed or how much it's costing them. So you can build both reimbursement or, profit opportunities or cost reduction opportunities for your hospital. MedPAR's a great data set. Premier, anybody know Premier data set? Premier, right? So the Premier is really the payers, about 1,000 hospitals, IDNs across the country, and they collect all of the data, right? And you can look at hospital trends, you can look at actual costs, you can really start to get granular in those. And when you take the power of those two data sets and you really start to leverage those, you can build really important healthcare economics models. Those, of course, are publishable. So you can start to build really the cost or the reimbursement opportunities or the profit opportunities that your technology could build. Now, of course, that takes time, but it's a very important piece. And again, all of those pieces start to add up. When you put them all together, now you can start to make really important cases for reimbursement, for new CPT codes, for new DRG codes, for actually NTAPs and those kinds of things. So those are ways that, again, when you begin with the end in mind, because really, what do you ultimately need to do? You need to get through the value analysis committees. You need to build compelling economic and clinical stories to be able to get your product into the supply chain, ready to be ordered, to be able to generate those first orders, and then, of course, ongoing orders from there. But how do you start it? You start it with a big end in mind. And you think about how that all gets related. It doesn't have to be individual and different activities, but think about how you can integrate these things across all your actions.
That's great. So let's talk about data then a little bit more. How do startups determine what type of data they need? How are they going to get that data? And maybe Prince of Medtech, is that what we're going to? How do you best
He's kind of dapper, isn't he?
How do you best display the data as well? So what type of data? How do they get it? How do you display it, and to which stakeholders? And maybe from an investor point of view, Sean, what expectations do you have and when? So maybe everybody contribute to that.
I'll take the lead on it. I think from a marketing perspective, we have great tools that are available to our disposal these days, aside from just social media. If you think about these LLMs like Perplexity, ChatGPT, and the reason why I mention this is because the old way of our industry used to be, hey, let's go to the conference and see who's up on podium, or just look at the PubMed and who's published the most. And the problem is, if you look at every single, let's say just a regular surgeon, think about every single part of their procedure. Do you not think that there's at least 1 or 2 startups trying to innovate in that part of that procedure, and then talk to that clinician to say, hey, you should, do a study for us? And so it becomes very, very crowded, and it's very often that you get somebody who isn't fully committed to you. They're dating other people at the same time. And so I think what's really important is that to start telling that story earlier on through social media in terms of the prototyping, some of the things you're doing in the lab, and it's maybe some early clinical data. For those who get freaked out, they're like, oh, but Omar, FDA. The FDA has draft social media guidance. You can read it, or I can just tell you right now, just don't make any stupid claims. Like, that's it. And the reason why you want to do that is that it allows you to sort of crowdsource at scale who might be a great clinician to partner with to do these trials for you. And at the same time, take maybe some PubMed data, take people who have published, people who have spoken at conferences, just talk to ChatGPT or Perplexity or any of these and feed them this data and say, based on our company and what we're trying to do, who do you think might be a really good early adopter? And you might be very surprised to find somebody that you never heard of. And every single company, including Intuitive, where Gary Guthart spoke this morning, some of their best early adopters, clinical adopters that changed the trajectory of the company, wasn't somebody that was the chair of surgery at HSS or anything. It's usually some random surgeon in some private practice or small academic institution no one's ever heard of. And they didn't really involve themselves with industry, but that one company fit a worldview that was resonant with them, and then they adopted it and made that trajectory much, much bigger.
I think that also goes beyond clinicians, though, right? I mean, you can get people from all different walks. So you could talk to people who have regulatory experience or reimbursement experience and understand what they would need or they would want, partner with them, et cetera.
100%. And I think the other thing to keep in mind is that compared to 20 years ago when I was in high school, and you can just walk up into the hospital. I remember I used to walk into the OR or into the surgery center and not announce who I was and just say, oh, I'm here to see Dr. So-and-so do surgery. And they're like, yeah, take some scrubs. You can just sell to the doctor right there. But these days you can't do that. There are other people involved. You have to think about nurses, supply chain, and all these people, believe it or not, are online curating and consuming this information. I had somebody who's the director of procurement supply chain for a large surgical center, and he actually came on my show and talked about how he actually checks things out on LinkedIn to learn about new companies and everything. And that's actually one way he decides who he should meet with, because he's able to get that information ahead of time versus getting a rep or a founder coming in with no background at all, no understanding, and then he has to spend that meeting understanding everything that they're doing.
So Adam, how do you determine what type of, how much data you need, what endpoints you need? From a CMS or a payer perspective versus regulatory, because we see sometimes even at NAMSA, sponsors will run a pivotal trial with endpoints to satisfy the regulatory body, and they'll often have to even repeat a study to gather more endpoints because they didn't consider what clinical endpoint payers might add expectations for. So, how is that kind of determined?
Right. So that is really kind of getting to the bridging of the valley of death thing, in the sense that, we telescope that gap. And so it's important to understand that the regulators have one audience and the payers are another and the clinicians are yet a third. And actually you brought up value analysis committees too. I mean, that could even be a fourth in there. So really, you have to talk to them. You have to find out what they need, and they're open to these discussions. So, I mean, FDA is very open to it. You can also approach CMS. They're a little more resource constrained, but you can certainly talk to them or try to talk to them. Get as much feedback and input as you can. Don't go to them with an open, what do I need to do? You're not going to get anything out of that discussion. But if you say, I'm proposing to do this, then they have something to think about, to chew on and give you feedback. And then you can hopefully telescope that as much as possible into as few efforts as possible. So for example, if I'm doing a study that are driven by regulatory evidence for safety and effectiveness, well, can I add 1 or 2 or 3 more endpoints that would cover medical necessity and reasonableness? Now I've covered CMS in the same study as I've covered FDA. So that kind of thinking. And yeah, it might make your study a little bigger. It might take a little more time, but not a whole second study or a third study. And so that's, I think, the answer.
Yeah,
that
that's helpful.
And if I can just add a little bit to that, because I think you made really important points. Because oftentimes we're cost constrained, we're time constrained, and so you get a little bit myopic in, I need to get this amount of sample size in order to get through the FDA. And then, you add in the reimbursement piece. But also, how is that going to resonate on podium? Because from a commercialization standpoint, you've invested all this money to generate the data, but is it robust enough, one, to get into peer-reviewed journals? Because, of course, that's gold, and that's what you'll need to arm your sales teams ultimately downstream to be able to go and carry your message out with. But also, is it compelling so that you're going to want to get your KOL or your PI on podium talking about that data? And is the audience going to appreciate the fact that it is a 20 sample patient study, or is it a 75 or 120 patient sample? So again, what is the audience that you're ultimately going to go to, and the specialty of clinicians that you're ultimately trying to get your message to resonate with? Is it compelling? Because again, if it's not compelling on podium, if it's not compelling in the peer-reviewed sort of journal space, but it gets you through the FDA, you're kind of missing the downstream pieces that are going to make you commercially successful.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. That's an excellent point.
Good, because that would be bad if you disagreed to me right on stage.
It would probably, yeah,
That never happens in panels.
probably have a black eye right now. But the point is, but be aware of the trap of doing it the other way around, which I see a lot of people doing, right? They're almost thinking of it as like a research project, that they'd go and they publish papers, and then they come to FDA or other audiences and they say, well, look, I published these 3 papers. It's great to publish those papers. Don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to discourage you, but what I'm saying is make sure you think again about the end in mind. And so if you're going to publish in journals, think about, I might want to take this data to FDA. It has to be regulatory quality as well. Because nobody wants to do these studies, pay for these studies. You get free journal articles, and then the FDA tears them apart, right? So think about that. And if you're early in the development stage, take advantage of like the pre-submission discussion pathway, so you can run all these things by FDA and get some feedback. And if they say you're crazy, pay attention to that and pivot. So yeah, I think that's great. Just a trap to be with.
Yep. Sean, from an investor perspective, kind of at what point in the fundraising cycle do you have expectations to see either coding or data or landscape, and what's the minimum amount that you're looking for, and how does that impact your decision making?
Yeah, I think it's, always depends. And I sit at the juncture of both the hospital side as well as the investor side, so I'll go over both. I think on the investor side, you're really looking for a lens of risk, right? So how much can we invest here at the lowest risk profile for a company for the return that we're looking for, and we underwrite that. And what that really means is that the risks that are there is clinical risk going through the FDA, and then there's reimbursement risk, which is the stuff that goes afterwards, and there's probably some value debt there too. And we're at a point, I think, with a lot of funds that are able to take out one or the other, but not both. And so you want to think about it as a operator well advanced with that lens in mind. And there's ways to, I think, plan for and mitigate against that. One is look for, if you're a new innovation, you have a lot of clinical risk, and the patient recruitment enrollment is going to be hard and expensive. Steer the company towards a established reimbursement at the end of, at least just to get started. Then you can expand out from there. Trojan horse it, get the technology codes and things like that. If it's a pretty incremental innovation, which is not wrong. We underwrite that all the time. It's a 510K. Maybe you can take on a little bit more risk into an adjacent area and go through a lot of that. And so we, as we make decisions around underwriting, it's a holistic mix of those. And if you're, blinking red on clinical risk and blinking red on reimbursement risk, it's really, really hard for me to champion your company in front of my partners and the investment committee. So that's how I see it on the investment side. I think on the hospital side, which is also where we underwrite and do a lot of diligence, we see the speed through VAC committees, right, of your competitor products. I sit on the board of a new product that was just approved last year, and their average through the committee is 40 days. That is whoppingly
That's amazing.
and I've never seen anything like it. And then I remind myself that these things do happen. Miracles do happen if you're innovating and you're investing on the end of it. But it takes a lot of planning, and it takes a lot of, I think, championing both through things like social media as well as relationship development with KOLs. And they will then start to pick up momentum. And so I think, looking at things around the value analysis committees and being able to use leading indicators like these champions or clinicians is really, really helpful. Have those conversations with these hospital, VAC committee members. They're more than willing to talk, actually, and it's very porous in terms of how they think, and so it's not a black box, but it does take a lot of thinking. So all in all, I think plan ahead as soon as possible and leverage some of those indirect resources like the VAC committee members, as well as thinking about it from a risk point of view is going to be really helpful for getting that check from an investor.
Yeah, and just to add a little bit about value analysis committees, because again, I understand, appreciate, have lived that whole where you're just trying to get your next milestone from a product development and your next pre-submission with the FDA. You're just so myopically focused. But value analysis committees are such an important. I'm not going to say newer because it has definitely been around for a long time, but you really see, so many products have absolutely a mandate to have to go through value analysis committees. And these value analysis committees are multidisciplinary in the hospital system. So you're going to have, potentially quality members. You've got the kind of bean counter finance people. You've got, the clinical advocacies. You've got risk management. You've got kind of all of these different entities that are looking at your product. And if you can't really continue to make a compelling argument for why a hospital will allow you to get through that, essentially the valley of death at the hospital level, then it doesn't matter in so many ways, how much of a champion that physician is or that healthcare provider is that wants your product. If it can't meet the baseline requirements of a value analysis committee, it's not going to get put into the supply chain in the hospital, and it's not going to be able to be ordered. So, don't lose sight of that piece as such an important piece in the healthcare buying process for, really most, if not all, of the products that we are innovating against today. And think about building the story that you're going to be able to convey, and it's going to be a multidisciplinary story. So again, I love the fact that Sean said, go in and talk to these entities, get an understanding of value analysis committees, especially if you're a little newer to the space. Or maybe you've been an academic, or you've been some doctors that decided that they had some great ideas, because these are important pieces of the supply chain and the buying process to ultimately get your product bought.
And yeah, just one more thing that that triggered me was in going through these VAC committees, there's different types of products actually, right? So I used to assume that it's all about price, and it's like the lowest price you could get. But if you're playing an area where there's not been any innovation for a decade, these doctors are dying to have something new, and you could actually get through them. And this particular product that went through 40-day average is one of those where there's been no innovation, and the existing product is just terrible, which I think a lot of you guys probably have a narrative for. And in that way, you can actually command speed as well as pricing, which is another huge part that I think merges return on investment as well as the reimbursement side that we don't talk about as much as how do you go out and price this And thinking about pricing, not to add another element to this, is you don't want to train the market, obviously, to be, some low price, and then you can't command those margins that then turn into revenue multiples, that then turn into big, acquisitions by these strategics. And so you want to think about pricing much earlier, and think about how you want to communicate your value to the VAC committees, to the KOLs, and command that pricing that you really deserve, right? Mm-hmm. And so start that early too, and maintain that as you're going along.
Yeah, Ivanny, just kind of hearing what everybody's saying, I had a thought here and I wanted to share with it. I'm a little off script here, but when you think about like the valley of death, there's multiple valleys of deaths in our industry, right? And I always think about being a startup guy, like every startup, it's like trekking over a mountain, like Mount Everest, right? And so if you were to go and scale Mount Everest, you don't just go and do that alone, because you'll die, all right? Mm-hmm. And what do? You get a Sherpa, you get a guide. And I think in our industry, a great representation of that is the service providers. For myself, I have a marketing and growth agency. We have NAMSA that does clinical. We have a lot of recruiters here. And, something that's very special about LSI, I've been coming to LSI every year since 2019. I always tell people, unless my wife's giving birth, like I'm going to be here every spring, which we try and plan so that the babies are not born yet this time. That's another story. But the reason why I mention that is that I feel like there are too many entrepreneurs that, whether it's through ego or fear, they try and do everything themselves. They see this mountain, they're like, okay, I'm going to start going up the mountain. After I get to like base 1 or 2, then I have some money. I'll go and get some marketing, or I'll talk to NAMSA, or I'll get a recruiter. And that's the wrong thing. The reason why is that the one thing that I've realized myself as an entrepreneur, the best thing that I did was to shortcut myself and talk to a service provider, even if I can't afford them. And I can guarantee you today, with all the service providers here, if you're an entrepreneur, you don't have the money, come talk to NAMSA, talk to a recruiter, talk to me. And if you can't afford our services, we're not going to say, hey, let me know when you've raised a bunch of money. If that happens, then you should just, blacklist that person. But this ecosystem is all about helping each other. And I can guarantee you, I'm looking out in the crowd, like I see Tyler, who's a good friend of mine, he's a recruiter, myself. My father was a surgeon. And every year, my father taught me that as part of his practice, he was going to do literally free surgery. So you would have somebody who comes in, cannot afford it. He would take care of the whole surgery. It's just part of it. And so I can tell you that a lot of the service providers here, we're used to that, and we want to help you. Come and just talk to us early. There's a founder here who could not afford any of the things that we do. My firm is not expensive, but it is pricey. I will say that. But we found a way to say, hey, let's just coach you so that you can do some things for now. And when it's time to come back and you have some funds, then we can help you more. As a service provider, again, whether it's NAMSA or Recruiter or anybody else, we'd rather provide some guidance from now, because I'll tell you this, the 15 minutes of free guidance we can give you is going to be way more valuable and helpful to you than if you try and go and scale this mountain by yourself. NAMSA has done thousands, maybe millions of clinical studies and data points, et cetera. For me, we worked with, not thousands yet, but many different companies. And so for us to just think very quickly and say, hey, do X, Y, Z, you'll be fine. It's just like a Sherpa. Maybe you can't afford a Sherpa, but you can call them and say, hey, just avoid this one area, you'll fall. Yeah. And then when you raise enough money, you can maybe afford to buy a Sherpa that'll just carry you on their back, and we'll get you to the very top of the mountain.
And it goes beyond just service providers, right? I mean, I'm not a service provider, but there are people that have been in the industry a long time, and I think because of the ecosystem that you mentioned, the fact of the matter is that people want to give back to the ecosystem. They want to share their experience. They want to give guidance. They want everybody to succeed. If the water rises with them, then let's rise the water together. Mm-hmm. And so for me, I love to talk to other entrepreneurs. I love to share insights and thoughts and my experiences. It's an N of one, but guess what? It's an N of one, and there's an N of 1,000 out here that can help you, and do it for free.
Exactly. And I think probably the most important thing to remember is that the reason why we do all of this is that, no offense to some of my sponsors, but we're not vertical SaaS industry. We're not selling marketing software. If this stuff doesn't happen, patients get hurt, they die, And so we'd rather find ways to help each other early on from now versus for us to have these egos and say, I don't have the money, or it's not worth the time. I'll figure it out on my own.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I want to make sure we have great feedback, everybody. I want to make sure we have some time if there's any questions. Otherwise, I can keep going. So if anyone does have a question, let me pause here. We have a microphone. I think we're recording. So, yeah. Good.
Who's got the first question?
No questions. They're ready for the test.
What does MedPAR stand for?
So maybe a question for Sean. When you're doing diligence, how do you pressure test either codes that you see or data that you're reviewing? I know, Adam and I have done some deals on the side, and reviewing pitch decks, we'll see some codes and I'll run it past him and they're inaccurate. I think once we even saw some made up codes, Adam, right? So
Yeah, we weren't going to say that in public, but yeah.
I love not saying who the sound is, but how do you pressure test it in your diligence? And
Yeah, I think there's certainly a bit of poker being played there where, you put in some complex codes and letters and numbers. At some point, I'll get jolted and say, I don't know, I'll just trust you.
ABC4.
There's quite a bit of that as well. But to Omar's point, there's the GPT LLM engines are there now, and I could type it in and fact check pretty quickly now. And it's certainly using that now in my memos as well as my diligence. So I think we're getting smarter on the whole. And so I think based on that, evolved context, it's really good to be able to show specific codes, and also evidence on that. And so I think we, investors, we look at one area and then like about half an hour later, we have to shift to something else. And so we never go deeper, but we look for patterns. Humans are pattern recognizers. And so we base the pattern recognition on something else. And so if there is a very familiar pathway or reimbursement, call to that and say, we're the next HeartFlow or we're the next NovaCure. That's really easy for us to get. And I think that's a great path to a narrative that I can then, again, take to my investment committee and say, they're the next HeartFlow or they're the next NovaCure. And that's a really easy conversation for everybody to get. I think the harder thing is if you're in a completely new field, and you're trying to build this, value creation proof. It's a really, really complex thing to tell the story. And I have to tell the story is the only thing I could probably say as a takeaway. So help me tell that story to my partners and investment committee.
how about maybe Don and Adam, how about communicating with regulatory bodies and payers in CMS? Is it good advice to include any questions like that in the pre-submission? Are there avenues to communicate directly with CMS? Do you suggest going directly to payers? How, in terms of kind of communicating, what are some best practices there?
Go first.
Yeah, I think that, what FDA has in place right now in the pre-submission program is kind of unique. It's not available in many other geographies. And so, the idea that you can go to them with a proposal, say, this is how I plan to go to market, this is what I plan to claim, this is the evidence I'm going to generate, and then getting their feedback on that is invaluable. I think, that program is available. It's a little bit slow. It takes about 70 days, right, to get your written feedback. And by the way, I'm not seeing any delay in that considering what has recently happened to FDA staffing. So I just wanted to get that out because I know a lot of people have questions about that. In terms of CMS and payers, it's a little more of a black box, to be honest with you. If you're doing a high-risk study and you need an investigational device exemption, you will have to get an IDE through CMS for them to take that data for payment. But there's a lot of other devices that are not significant risk, and they just ignore CMS at their para. So if you can get in front of them and say, look, this is the trial I'm going to run, will this provide you with the evidence you need? Getting their feedback will be also super helpful. So try to work with them. I think the harder ones are the last audience. I'll finish up real quick which is really the clinical audience. And what do I mean by that? It's going to be like if you're in the cardiology space, go to the ACC, go to the AHA, go to the Heart Failure Society, or whatever you're working in. They have innovation working groups, every single one of them, and talk to them, get in front of them, present to them, and get their input on what they're going to want to see you do to get in the guidelines of care, right? That's the holy grail, get into the guidelines of care. So anyway, hope that answered your question, but I would definitely go for them.
Just one question for you. So investigational versus experimental when you're filing that sort of CMS with your IDE. You want to speak to that for these guys?
Say that one more time.
Investigational like versus experimental. So
Yeah.
if you're developing your clinical trial, you're working through your IDE, ideally there's a way for you to get reimbursement through Medicare and the payers. And again, in my experience, the difference between experimental and investigational are very important distinctions in whether or not you might get reimbursement for your procedure versus not, even in your IDE.
So experimental, no payment.
Correct.
That is just the way it is. And so that is the default go-to.
So you're paying for every single expense that you incur with that clinical trial because and the hospital's not going to pay for it. So CMS isn't going to pay for it, then guess who pays for it? He does. He does. But you got to raise the money. And then investigational.
Right? Yeah, so investigational, you have to have that designation as investigational. So you need to go to that, whoever that audience is, it's the FDA, CMS, whatever, and get an investigational designation for your product. Then they have actual coverage pathways for you. And it depends on whether you're inpatient, outpatient, how much you cost, et cetera. And there's also coverage for evidence generation. There's a whole pathway to do that. They'll cover you for 3 years while you do your study. So you need to get investigational. Thank you for prompting me.
I wanted to bring that up before we ran out of time.
Yeah, thank you. Well, let's give these guys a round of applause. We're at time. But thank you all. Thank you.